share. Okay, so like I said, we are going to be taking ecology on a more time-based scale, and we are going to talk about evolution. So, my goal for you is to describe how evolution can affect populations over time. Because we have been talking about a lot of different populations and communities and community interactions and all that fun stuff. And every single one of these things kind of plays into that ecology bit. So, my goal is for you to be able to use those ecological terms, populations, communities, all that fun stuff, and use this evolutionary terminology to talk about how those change over time. So, anybody have any questions? Okay, so what is evolution? What is evolution? Evolution is a change in a population's gene pool over time. This down here with the little squigglies is our super big important idea for this lesson for the next couple days. We'll talk about evolution again tomorrow. So, individuals do not evolve, populations do. So we grow and change over time as part of being human, right? But that is not considered evolution. Evolution is how populations change over time, specifically in their gene pools. And I'll talk about what a gene pool is in a second. Oh, excuse me. So, evolution is the change in a population's gene pool over time. And when I'm talking about time, I'm not talking about like over the next couple minutes. I'm talking about 50, 60, 100, 150, 200, 300 years at a time. Right? We're talking a large scale time and small scale change. So small changes over a lot of time add up over even more time. So evolution is a change in a population's gene pool over time. Whew. So, a gene pool is all of the genes in a population. And a gene is a sequence of DNA that codes for particular traits. So, we've got our population of frogs down here. We've got 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 green frogs, 1 red frog, and 2 of these fuchsia-looking purpley frogs. That's the population. The gene pool is the genes for these colors. So 12 green genes, 2 purple genes, 1 red gene. If you've taken a biology course, you probably know a little bit more about what these genes are, what it stands for. The term allele might ring a bell, but that's a little bit out of the scope of our environmental science understanding. What we need to know is that all of these genes are sequences of DNA. So we've got a little bit of DNA that codes for these traits, these physical characteristics, and that all of those little pieces of DNA, all of those genes that code for all of those different characteristics is considered the gene pool. So the gene pool in this population is 12 green genes, 2 fuchsia genes, 1 red gene. Population versus gene pool. So, evolution is the change in these gene pools over time. So how many green ones there are over time might change. How many purple ones there are over time might change. How many red ones there are over time might change. And there are a couple of different ways that this change can happen, which we'll talk about. So, genes and gene pools. So, what does evolution do? Evolution often leads to changes in appearance or behavior. That's mainly what evolution is going to change over time. Appearance or behavior. So they are going to change the genes for this appearance or behavior. So for this one right here, we've got, we'll say these are bugs. And this year there are 80 green genes or 80% green genes and 20% brown genes in this bug population. The year later, the next year, there are 60% green genes and 40% brown genes. So the year after that, there is 40% green genes and 60% brown genes. Those percentages changing over time is what we mean by evolution. Those genes are changing over time. So, changes in population from generation to generation. Again, that key word being in a population. Individuals do not have gene pools, they just have genes. A population, which is a group of individuals of the same species, if we're thinking way back, population has a gene pool. Yeah. So, change over time in these genes leads to changes in physical characteristics and behavioral changes. More commonly, it is physical, like appearance behavior things rather than behavior. Behavior is a lot more learned than it is genetically what's the word I'm looking for? Determined. And genes are easier for evolution to act on, which we'll see in a moment, or genes for physical appearance. So there are a lot of different mechanisms or ways that evolution happens. A lot of different ways evolution can happen. We're going to talk about 4 of them. The first is mutations, so changes in that DNA sequence. The second is migrations. This one's also called gene flow. The third is genetic drift. And the fourth is natural selection, or and artificial selection also. But we'll talk about that later. So these are our 4 mechanisms for changes in populations over time. Mutations, migrations, genetic drift, and natural selection. These are our 4 mechanisms, or 4 ways that populations can change over time. Doing okay? All right, this is our process for biological evolution. Changes in populations' gene pools can happen in these 4 ways: mutations, migrations, genetic drift, and natural selection. So we're going to go through these one by one. The first being mutations. A mutation is a change in DNA, so some sort of edit to the DNA sequence, that gives rise to variation or creates a difference in a certain gene among individuals. These mutations, because they are in our DNA, are passed from generation to generation and can lead to evolution. So it is a big source for genetic variation. So for example, here we had 2 green bugs, and this bug underwent some sort of mutation, a change in their DNA sequence. And that change in that DNA sequence led to a change in coloration, meaning that bug turned brown. Now, if that change was early enough in their DNA or in a germline or in the cells that are passed down to the next generation, that mutation gets passed down. So the next generation can have even more brown bugs. And then if those brown bugs survive and live and have more baby bugs, they can have even more brown bugs. Changing the gene pool by adding to the gene pool. That is how a mutation can lead to evolution. All right. All right. The second is gene flow or migration. This should say or, not of. Migration or gene flow. Gene flow occurs when a group immigrates or emigrates, enters or leaves, and the genetic proportions change, and then that change leads to changes in the gene pool over generations. So, this typically only affects small populations. Usually, when individuals leave or enter big populations, it doesn't make much of a difference. For example, if we were to have another person enter this class, let's say this person has like naturally really light blonde hair, right? That would change the proportion of people with blonde hair in this classroom, right? The amount of people with blonde hair would go up. We don't have a heck of a lot of blonde people in here today. So our gene pool would go up, right? Or that percentage of that gene would go up. Now, if somebody with, or if one of our people who do have blonde hair in this classroom get up and leave, right? That would also really affect the proportion of blonde people in our classroom, right? Now think about the school or the state. If somebody with blonde hair drives across state lines, it's not going to affect the population distribution that much. It's not going to affect the percentage of people with blonde hair by very much. So this usually only happens in small populations. So for example, right here, we've got 2 bug populations. I don't know why the bugs were super popular, but they're easy to think about genetics. So we've got a population of green bugs and we've got a population of brown bugs. Migration or gene flow happens when one of these bugs enters the population of the other bug. This brown bug entered this green one, and it has introduced this new brown gene to this gene pool. So this is another way evolution can happen. It's another way we can introduce variation in a gene pool or change a gene pool. And finally, we have natural selection. Natural selection is the process by which traits that improve an organism's chance for survival and reproduction are passed down more frequently from to the next generation. So, my example down here, we've got a bunch of bugs, green bugs and brown bugs, because that's our big example for today, green bugs and brown bugs. Now, the birds that eat these bugs prefer the green ones. So if there's a smorgasbord of bugs just laying around, these birds have their pick. They're going to pick all the green ones. If you were a bug in this population, what type of bug would you want to be? Probably a brown bug, right? If you didn't want to get eaten up by a bird. If these birds come in and eat all these green bugs, that's going to mean that the next generation of bugs is going to be more brown, right? This is the process of natural selection. Having a certain characteristic makes it better or easier for an organism to survive and to reproduce. So another example, lions, right? We've got lions. In a population of lions, is it going to be the faster lions or the slower lions that eat more? Yeah. Why? Okay, I like the reverse engineering there. Which ones are going to get more food though? Which ones are going to be better at getting food? The faster ones or the slower ones? The faster ones, right? The faster ones can run farther, catch more gazelles, eat more. So over time, that lion will live to breed another day, and the slow lion wasn't very good at catching food, so it doesn't live long enough to pass its genes down to the next generation. right? So over time, if only the fastest lions survive, all of the lions over generations and generations and generations and generations are going to get faster and faster and faster and faster. This happens a lot of the times with birds, specifically with their colors, right? We think about birds, we think about like all of those beautiful like colored feathers, especially like jungle birds, right? Birds are very sexually selective, right? Birds choose their mates very carefully. So, if only the birds with the brightest tail feathers lived to have babies, or were selected to have babies, that means the next generation of birds would be brighter and colorful, right? And if only the brightest and most colorful of those birds got chosen to have babies, then the next generation would be even more bright and even more colorful. And that process is the process of natural selection. A little bit of history. You don't need to write this down. I just wanted to kind of give it to you because I love this stuff. Natural selection, the idea of natural selection came from these two men right here, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. They both came up with the idea of natural selection. They both wrote about it. Charles Darwin just got his stuff out there first and published in a more reputable journal. So, Charles Darwin is more well known as like the father of evolution, the guy who came up with this idea. But they both came up with the concept independently. If you read up on Charles Darwin, he wrote a book called On the Origin of Species. It is his kind of layout of this idea. And he got this idea because he got on a boat right after college and explored the world and was really curious and observed everything around him, which is a lot of what science is. So that's the history of natural selection. And there's a heck of a lot more where that comes from. So there are, in his idea for natural selection, in his description, there were 4 prerequisites or 4 things that have to be met in order for natural selection to take place. So we're going to talk about those 4 prerequisites for natural selection, conditions that have to be met. The first one is a struggle for existence. Some organisms need to produce more offspring than can survive. That's thing number 1. There has to be a struggle. If there's not a struggle, then everybody survives evenly. Everybody's on an equal footing. We need to have more organisms than can survive. That's condition number 1. Condition number 2 is that characteristics must be heritable. Heritable means in our DNA. So that means they have to be able to be passed down from generation to generation. If I go out tomorrow and dye my hair red, does that mean that my children will have red hair? No. If I go out and I get a hair straightener and straighten my hair, does that mean my kids will have straight hair? No. If a characteristic is selected on by natural selection, it has to be heritable. So these traits have to be able to be passed down from generation to generation. Otherwise, we're not going to see these changes over time. So these are our first 2 conditions. There's 2 more. So, organisms have to struggle, and these characteristics must be inherited, or heritable. First 2. The next 2 Individuals must vary in fitness, and I have two very important vocabulary words in here. Fitness, so that is, make sure you get these two definitions down if you've been not writing anything. These two definitions are important. Fitness is how well an organism can survive and reproduce in its environment. Key word here, environment. If I took an alligator from Florida, if I picked up an alligator and I took it home with me and I released it in a cornfield, that alligator going to live very long in the cornfield? Probably not. If I took a polar bear, one of the few polar bears that are left, if I took a polar bear from the North Pole and I plopped it down in the middle of Arizona, you think it'd last very long? No. Organisms are fitted for their environment. Their fitness depends on their environment. So the alligator was very, very fit for that mucky Florida marsh. Right? Green, swimming, kind of blends in, knows how to eat, knows where to get food, knows how to live alligator life. Not necessarily so fit for the middle of a cornfield. It might catch a raccoon or a possum or something, but it's not going to be as happy, be as suited for the environment as it would be swimming around in that marsh. Fitness is affected by adaptations. An adaptation is a heritable, has to be inherited, a heritable trait that increases an organism's fitness. A heritable trait that increases an organism's fitness. So, what is something that an alligator has that allows it to better survive and reproduce in its Florida marshy goodness? What's something that that organism has to make it better at living in that environment? Yeah, 2 eyes. Yeah, that's an adaptation, and they're good eyes too. And they sit right up above their heads so they can see outside of the water without having to come up out of the water. That's an adaptation. They did. Did they use them very much? What makes you say that? Why'd they go with it if they used them all the time? That's evolution, right? They were, the organisms with the shorter legs were more fit for their environment. Therefore, over time, their legs got shorter. And the last condition for natural selection is survival of the fittest. Meaning the individuals with higher fitness reproduce more. If every organism reproduced the same amount, regardless of their fitness, natural selection wouldn't take place, right? If we had a bird with really, really bright tail feathers and a bird with really, really dull tail feathers, and naturally only the really, really bright tail feathered bird found a mate and had bird babies, that would lead to natural selection. But if something happened and the other birds, the dull tail feathered bird, also got to reproduce, that means that the gene pool isn't going to change, right? The gene pool is going to stay the same because everybody reproduced, everybody passed those traits on. That makes sense? This doesn't just happen in nature. We as humans do this too. But when we do it, we call it artificial selection because it's not happening naturally. We're doing it ourselves. So, if we, so humans kind of hacked this system pretty early. We figured out that if we had traits that we liked in an animal or a plant, we could breed only the ones that had those traits we liked, and that would give us animals or plants more suited to what we need. So with wolves, right? The ancestor of most dogs today. If we took a wolf and we bred only the big ones and only the tall ones, and we took the two tallest out of that and we bred just those two, over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, we get something like the Great Dane. But if we took a wolf and we bred only the smallest and only the smallest and only the smallest over time, again and again and again and again, we get something like the Chihuahua. But this isn't just for animals. We also do this with plants. And it's not just something that like scientists do in labs, right? My stepmom, her grandparents live down in Spencer, not too far away. And every year, they used to, they've kind of stopped doing it now, they're getting up there. They grew a big old garden, like tomatoes, jalapenos, squash, cucumbers, the works. And every year, they would also grow popcorn. And that popcorn, they would pop every year. We'd spend like 3 days down there making caramel corn. And then they gave that caramel corn out to everybody as Christmas gifts. That was just their thing. And every year, they would do multiple batches of popcorn, of course, because it takes a lot of time and effort. And they would pay attention to which of the popcorn batches turned out better. Right? So the popcorn seeds from this plant, the popcorn seeds from this plant, the popcorn seeds from this plant. They would figure out which one popped better popcorn, and they would save those seeds, and those seeds are what they would plant next year for the next round of popcorn. And then the next year, they would only save the seeds from the popcorn that popped the best. And over time, their popcorn got better and better and better and better. And they did this for like 60 plus years. They're like 80 some years old now. So this isn't just something that big old scientists or animal scientists or farmers do. It could be something you do in your backyard. Granted, it takes some time. So that is artificial selection. That is natural selection controlled by humans. Questions here? All right. Almost done. Almost done. So, natural selection over time can lead to a process called speciation. Speciation is the process by which new species are formed. Remember, a species is a group of individuals with similar characteristics that can breed and produce fertile offspring. That's the definition of a species from earlier in the unit. Now, at some point in time, when two groups get so different from one another that they can no longer interbreed, we call that speciation. We have formed a new species. So the most common example of speciation goes back to Charles Darwin. On his journey, he stopped in the Galapagos Islands, just off the coast of Ecuador, and he studied the bird populations on these different islands. These Galapagos finches, or even now we call them Darwin's finches, because he studied them so much. And what he saw was all of these finches with a bunch of different, slightly different beak characteristics. And he proposed that at one point in time, there was one finch ancestor, and based on which island that ancestor flew to, and what foods were available on that island, different birds with different shaped beaks survived better and reproduced more. And this happened so often and over so much time that it led to all of these new finch populations. And there are a lot of ways for speciation to occur, with a lot. But there's only one that we are going to talk about in this class, and that is geographic isolation. Geographic isolation is one of the mechanisms for speciation. They can also be isolated in time or in behavior, but we are just going to focus on location, like physical location. So we're going to go over that, and I think that's all I got. So, a little bit longer. I know it's Monday. It's been a minute. All right. So, this is the process of speciation with geographic isolation. So, we start with a single population. We start with a single population. We'll say these are bugs again because bugs. Right? We start with a single population. Something happens, and that population is divided into two groups. Let's say a dam bursts, and now there is a river running through this population. Okay. We are physically divided into two groups. This creates two different gene pools. Okay? And these gene pools experience different environments. Let's say that the grass is really, really tall on this side of the river. Which means in order to get around, the bugs on this side of the river need to grow really long legs. Okay? Over time, these bugs changed so much that now, if something were to happen and this river were to dry up, or if there were to be bridges built across the river, these bugs could no longer successfully interbreed. And at that point where they become no longer able to interbreed, we call them two separate species. We say that speciation has occurred. So the physical separation of these two species of this one species into two groups has led over time. This didn't happen overnight. This happened over years and years and years and years and years. Created two new species. I got one more example for you. So, another example. We got bugs. We got speciation happening. So, we've got our population of bugs. We've got our river separating the two. Over time, this group of bugs, their gene pool, increased the amount of green in their population. This happened over so much time that eventually all of the bugs in this population have this green gene, and all of the bugs in this population stayed this brown color. Now, over time, if these two populations were to come back together, they could no longer interbreed. Questions? Doing okay? Okay. Last bit, I promise. Extinction. We talked about the creation of a species. Now we're going to talk about a species no longer being around. Extinction is the disappearance of a species from Earth. No more species. That species is gone. That is extinction. It is thought that 99% of all of the species that have ever lived on Earth are now extinct. It's a lot of species. Extinction is a disappearance of a species from Earth. Yes. Interesting. I don't know exactly what you're talking about, but there is something called convergent evolution, where two species evolve to become very, very similar. Not the exact same, but very, very similar. It happens with crabs all the time. Crabs have evolved independently like 6 different times. So if a bird species goes extinct and then another bird species changes so much to become almost identical to that other bird, it's not impossible. So, extinction is when we lose species for good. This is the last slide. Most extinctions are gradual. Slowly over time, a species becomes less fit and less fit and less fit and smaller and smaller and smaller until they die off. This is called the background extinction rate, the amount of species that would naturally just go extinct because of evolution. But there are some instances called mass extinction events. Think meteor hitting Earth, killing all dinosaurs. That is a mass extinction event where most of the species, or a big number of species, get wiped out all at once. As a mass extinction event. In fact, a lot of scientists would argue that we are currently at the start of what could be another mass extinction event, with the amount of species currently on the endangered species list. But that's another story for another day. So, background extinction rates are just like the natural low level of extinctions that happen over time. And mass extinctions are when we get a bunch all at once. Do we have any questions? It's a lot of information today. Crash course evolution. So, we have about 10 minutes left in class. In that 10 minutes, I want you to make sure that you turned in that species interaction activity from Friday, where you read that article about the species interaction, whether it be mutualism, commensalism, whatever. Make sure we get that in. That is one of the first grades of the new 9 weeks, and we want to make sure we are starting out on the right foot. All right. Any questions for me? Yes. Yes. It's on Canvas. Everything's on Canvas. Yeah.